My wife says I'm over dramatic. Hello everyone, it's Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So the show is back. The show has been remonetized and super chats and everything else is back up. I want to thank everybody for your kind words. And by the way, even I think bugging the hell out of them, they allowed the previous funds to be released. So your complaints, your bitching, I would imagine my complaints and my moaning at them served some good ends. So thank you all very much. But the show is, I think I said, the testicles have been reattached to the show or something. So good. That's a worry. That's off my head. So let's start with 420. Let's kick it off good. Let's celebrate. One of my subscribers asked me to do a show on Tom Campbell. I've done shows on Tom Campbell before, and I've never done Tom Campbell justice. So I'm going to try to do Tom Campbell justice again on this show. He's fascinating. I think you can make the argument is, there is a God. God is the computer. That's ultimately, I think the basic argument would be in a kind of roundabout way. Don't think of computer in the way you think of computer. Just think of it in the sense of a radically, fantastically, over-the-top, incomprehensible, complex thing that can generate something else. Don't mistake the symbol for the actual thing. I guess that's my point. So this is, let's start here. Let's start at Bob Monroe. This is Bob Monroe. Bob Monroe was a radio guy, and at some point along the way, he started having out-of-body experiences. Like, incessantly. He couldn't control it. It was freaking him out. He didn't know what it was. He would find himself on the ceiling, looking down at his wife, panicking remorselessly. He went to the doctor. The doctor said, "There's nothing wrong with you. You can go to India, and there's some guys there that study for 10 years and all this other stuff." But Bob, at some point, starts trying to learn about it and gets to the point of being able to not just enter into the state without freaking out, but controlling it. Like entering into the out-of-body state at will, persistently. Now think about that for a moment. Like, and by the way, this is a Blaze One If You Got One episode. So Blaze One If You Got One, because this is going to be one of those episodes. Yes, I'm saying it's stoned. I'm saying it hammered, completely, flabbergastedly stoned. The reason I say that is this. I want an open mind. I want for the moment you to exist in the spot that everything that I'm saying is absolutely true. You can tell me I'm an asshole later. But for the moment, exist in a spot. Because when you exist in a spot and you allow yourself in that slight, tweak into the way people experience reality, it's reality. Sometimes they get a feeling that they didn't get before that gives more context and clarity to something else. I hope that makes sense. One of the things I always say, pot gets me into my heart center. And it's one of those things where sometimes I don't necessarily get something until you see it from a different perspective. And you're like, oh, I get that. I mean, I like that perspective. I may still disagree with it later, but at the very least I get it. That's where I want the person to be in these type of episodes. That's why I said Blaze One If You Got One. All right, so Bob Monroe, out-of-body experiences, wasn't able to control it. Gets to the point where he can control it. And this gets more profound. I mean, he ends up meeting beings outside of in these OBs. Some of these have been guides or people who've worked with him over the course of his life. And he's been able to look at Earth and the world from a fundamentally different perspective. And a perspective that not a large number of people get to look at the world on, because from his standpoint, he would argue, I am standing outside of what is typically the human context, and I'm looking down on this planet. Now, this guy who's doing this constantly opens up schools and everything else, but he wants to study the process. So it wasn't enough for him to do this. Like, it wasn't this subjective state that he wanted. He wanted to know, what is the reality of this, not what do I think is taking place, if that makes sense. There's a difference in those things. He hired 2 physicists. One of those physicists, that's a hard word to say, physicist, Tom Campbell, the gentleman who we were talking about tonight. Tom Campbell was one of the physicists, physicists, who worked with Bob Monroe to test out any and everything related to psi phenomena, including this, and especially this. Tom Campbell was interested in learning Bob's out-of-body states and how he gets to those states, whereas Bob was interested in scientific investigation of what was taking place. Now, the beauty of this is, because they had 2 scientists working with them, they would have these check units where they would have both of them in, and both of them would be experiencing out-of-body states together, meaning they're experiencing reality together out of body, which means that if it's purely a subjective state, it would be impossible for them to experience the state together. They were recording the events as they were going along. They were doing this for a while, meaning they got good enough at this where they could kind of dip in and out without necessarily fully losing the thread of what they would consider to be the out-of-body state. Now, the fact is, we don't know if people are going out of anything. We don't even know if this experience, if any of this experience is outer. And I'll explain that later. But from the relative perspective of the person involved in the process, it seems like they were outside of themselves, looking at a different situation. Tom is interesting in this because Tom didn't believe this before, and it took a while for Tom to actually get to the point of saying, even having experiences like this and saying, okay, there's something here. There's something here. Fair enough. There's something here. Tom starts to try to understand what they were experiencing and why they were experiencing, and come to this realization of, look, if reality is what physicists are saying reality is, then certain things shouldn't act the way they do. And that some of the dilemmas that they have in physics, one particular, is only because they're not looking at the world correctly. They're looking at the world through a physical lens when the world is not physical. Now, this is not necessarily insane. Like, fact is, various points, pillars of science have been, gotten rid of. This deterministic universe of Newton was essentially destroyed by Einstein saying, yeah, look, it's relative. You can sit on a train and, time is flexible and all this other stuff. Space is malleable. And even Einstein being to some degree undermined by quantum physics. God playing dice with the universe. Look, my point is this. There are various points in which each level of physics gets undermined by this kind of sea change that gets us to look at the world in a different way. I'm saying Tom Campbell is making the argument that this is one of those sea changes, that the world is, regardless of what our senses tell us, is not a physical thing. And I would argue scientists would not argue that. Now, the catch becomes where he goes with that and goes to the study of consciousness. Now, this goes into 2 parts. Part of this is what he experiences himself from the standpoint of these out-of-body states and these altered states, whether it's remote viewing, whether it's OBEs, whatever. The other part of it is using the double slit experiment to kind of further this argument, and even going so far as to craft an experiment, which he's getting funding for because he wants to implement, to try to nail down whether or not what he's saying is true. Meaning, consciousness is the thing that's propelling this universe. You're not a body with a consciousness. You're a consciousness that projects a body. And we need to start looking at the world in those terms. There's something more specific here that I want to get at that I think is more profound, and regardless of what he's saying. I mean, because all of this is profound. If this is true, this is amazingly profound. I make this case that, double slit. Let's do double slit. So, in very basic terms, if you throw a baseball at, let's say you had 2 slits. in a board. Let's say you're at a baseball stadium. You have two slits in a board. You take a baseball and you throw it at the two slits. And instead of the baseball choosing one or the other slits, it goes through both. You end up with a wave distribution of that baseball. Now, that makes no sense in a world that's physical. And it gets weirder because whether or not it does that depends on whether or not you're looking at which slit it goes through. So if you're looking at the slits to determine which slit that ball goes through, it chooses one or the other. It makes a choice. If you're not looking, it goes through both. This is, again, weird. And it shouldn't do that in a physical universe. I'm using this as an allegory for what the double slit experiment does with photons or with electrons, and the odd particle wave duality that's evoked in this. Even more weirder when you add the idea that consciousness becomes the tool to determine whether or not it becomes a particle or a wave. Tom Campbell's point is, look, it's staring you in the face that the problem with this is you don't want to look at it that way. You're looking at this as a purely physical experience. And yeah, maybe from the standpoint at which you experience it, yes, but not necessarily from the underlying thing of the universe. And to his point, look around you in the room. Look at me. Look at whoever's around you. There's no there that's out there per se. All of this stuff is taking place in your head. Literally, all of this is taking place in your head. There may be a reality out there. You would never know what that reality is. There could be something standing beside you right now that's just outside the scope of your senses, and you would never know. You only know what your senses allow you to know, meaning you have no idea what's out there. You have no idea what's out there. We have to make assumptions of the world just to process the world. Let's go too far in the weeds. My point is, larger consciousness system. Now, Tom Campbell's point is not alone. There are interesting people who are joining into this conversation.
Oh my God.
Where have you landed?
Why would you ask that?
I'm asking that here and now. It's New York City. It's March 7th.
Well, partly it's taken to these very strange images that are behind your head right now. These are pictures of equations. I've been, for the last 15 years, trying to answer the kinds of questions that my colleagues here have been raising. And what I've come to understand is that there are these incredible pictures that contain all the information of a set of equations that are related to string theory. And it's even more bizarre than that, because when you then try to understand these pictures, you find out that buried in them are computer codes just like the type that you find in a browser when you go surf the web. And so I'm left with the puzzle of trying to figure out whether I live in the matrix or not.
Wait, you're blowing my mind at this moment. So you're saying, are you saying your attempt to understand the fundamental operations of nature leads you to a set of equations that are indistinguishable from the equations that drive search engines and browsers on our computers?
That is correct. So,
wait, I have to just be silent for a minute here. So you're saying as you dig deeper, you find computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos.
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code.
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just sort of resembles computer code. You're saying it is computer code.
It's not even just is computer code. It's a special kind of computer code that was invented by a scientist named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. That's what we find very, very deeply inside the equations that occur in string theory and in general in systems that we say are supersymmetric. Okay.
I love that clip. That's one of my favorite clips. Neil deGrasse Tyson is mind blown. He's only mind blown because of the perspective of certain assumptions that were made about the world. You have no idea what this is. Why do you assume you know what this is? I'm always fascinated by people who are like, yes, I know exactly what this is. How? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? Look, my point is this is pretty basic. Because there's something a little bit more awesome than this, than just what these guys are saying or what these guys are postulating. Meaning. What does it mean? What does it mean? Dwell on that shit for the moment. Say they're right. Say that everything that these guys are saying is absolutely correct. Tom Campbell, with his big toe, he has this thing called My Big Theory of Everything, the larger consciousness system, meaning that matrix that these guys are talking about is what Tom Campbell describes as a larger consciousness system. Essentially, a system that is designed to mature intelligence and consciousness. Like, essentially, your job is to mature as a consciousness, to become a better consciousness. That love is an operational function in the universe itself. That, for the most part, anything that needs to be built with a certain degree of cooperation. And that cooperation, in that sense, is the essence of love in a scientific sense. It's religion fused into a rational way of thought. Like, this idea of decision space, the shrinking of decision space, or this idea that in the same way that your body can be broken in a video game, well, yeah, your body can be broken in this game too, because we're a rules-based system. What this guy's saying, error correction code, it is a rules-based system. That's the argument that they make. Look, there's some stuff I think with Tom Campbell is right. There's some stuff I argue with. Some of the stuff I think he's right on is from personal experience. Some of the stuff that I argue with is from personal experience that I don't necessarily want to accept. And I accept that there's no way for him to know, per se. Tom Campbell has his own biases. He's a person. And his understanding of the world that he's seeing, that's to some degree subjective, has to be influenced based on how he thinks as a person. And it is. I would wager that if you look at Bob Monroe's books, all three, I've read all of them, how Bob Monroe is, that experience to some degree is shaped around it. I'm not necessarily saying there's no reality to it. And then we get into this idea, what does reality mean in the first place? We call reality just stuff that we take on this kind of waking consciousness, into what we consider waking consciousness. But if you're experiencing, if you're remembering, if you're still having all of these things that you would have had even if you're in your waking state, what does it matter? Isn't it still real? What does it mean to be real? Anyway, meaning. It's meaning. What does it mean? When I argue politics, I do it from a secular level. I don't know your God. I don't care about your God. I have no belief in your God. So let's start this conversation from, let's pretend, at least in this political space, that nothing exists, and let's go from there. Let's make our points. But what if that's not true? Now, not God in the sense of man on a cloud, wings, and everything else, but purpose. What does it mean to add purpose? And purpose in this sense, he would argue, to evolve the consciousness of the people involved. Now, this means that there are certain things that the system allows in order to improve the person. This also means that there's a certain degree of purpose, even in situations of suffering that the person is encountering. Sometimes these things are haphazard. Sometimes these things are not haphazard. Like, it's a fascinating way of looking at the world. And even looking at the world beyond that point. What does it mean? Like, the meaning part to me is the most profound thing to this. It's one thing to say there's no God, nothing matters, there's no right, there's no wrong, everything's off the table. For the most part, the only thing you have is human conception, and right and wrong is purely in relation to us. But when that's off the table, and there is purpose, and there is meaning, what does it mean in that context? I am weighted with bated breath to hear Tom Campbell's experiment take place. He's going to do his experiment. He's trying to do additional things to the double slit experiment to try to get more precise in regards to determining how. His argument is there's certain things that scientists haven't tested with the double slit that need to be tested, because his belief is that depending on the results of the test, it's a dispositive. It's one of those things of, if this is true, the other thing is impossible. If this is blue, it can't be green. If this is up, then it can't be down. It's that type of stuff. If this person is pregnant, then this person is not pregnant, or whatever. It has to be one or the other. Either you're pregnant or you're not. If the person is pregnant, they're pregnant. He did a FundMe campaign, and he raised the money for that campaign. and he is now trying to put together his experiments to do this. This, like I said, exists in a space for a moment, because I find this to be a fascinating space to exist in. From my own experiences, in the same way that Tom Campbell, or in the same way that Bob Monroe, had something that interacted with him for a period of time. Same thing here. Same thing here. Now, Tom Campbell would say that is a artifact of the consciousness system trying to prod a person into a particular direction, or to help with the growth of the consciousness of the person involved. And he would even go so far as to say it's not really real, or it's not really real in the sense of real in the way that you're thinking of real, which gets bizarre. Bob Monroe, I don't think, took it that way. I think Bob Monroe took it as, no, these things are real, these are the experiences that I have. So in this case, I think there's some degree of disagreement. But again, this goes into the way Tom Campbell thinks of the world through this kind of rigid scientific mindset, that allows certain caveats, because he can enter certain states that allows him to see these things for himself. It's fascinating, that's all. And the larger consciousness system thing is an interesting thing. Tom Campbell has a book called My Big Toe. He has 3 versions of those books. They are dry, I'm sorry. They're brutally dry. But they're extremely interesting. And if you ever get a chance to hear his lectures, Tom Campbell can talk for like 6 hours about My Big Toe. But it is a fascinating thing. And it has to be considered. We don't know what this is. And pretending as if we do is nonsense. Right now, you have no idea whether there's anybody else on the planet other than you. For all you know, this is something that you've plugged yourself into, or you've lost your memory, when you've kicked off. You have no idea. You have a memory, you have a future and everything else, so you go with the idea of the evidence and say, okay, most of the evidence says this is what it is, and I go with it. And even if I thought it was something else, it doesn't necessarily matter, because I can get hungry, my head can hurt, people can beat me with sticks. I need to comply into the system to which I function in. I suspect if somebody grabbed you and took you to an insane asylum, within 6 months you would probably think you were insane and think all this shit was fantasy. We don't know. We don't know. So, Tom Campbell, largest consciousness system. I hope I did this some degree of decency this time. Nobody's here. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. I can't believe nobody cares about this one. Oh well. The universe is unknowable, mathematical, and under no obligation to make sense. Exactly. At least that makes sense to us. At least that makes sense to us. Alright, I'm going to end this since nobody cares about this one. I am going to have patron appreciation on Sunday. Let's say Sunday at 5 o'clock. Let's say Sunday at 1 o'clock. All right, yeah, let's say Sunday at 1 o'clock. Everyday progressive try. I do care about this one. I don't get it. Origin of consciousness and a breakdown of the bicameral mind. I love that. The topic does blow my mind. What does the world look like if the world started thinking of itself as being something more than just meat suits that expire? I don't know. Goes beyond words. What the fuck? Really, let's not have a dialogue. What? What are you talking about? Who was the scientist that deconstructed string theory into 1940 computer code? I have no idea. Hologram. So Tom Campbell would argue against the hologram thing. Tom Campbell would say, well, no, it's not a hologram because the hologram has certain properties that don't fit into the model. It's like you have to it's the virtual reality model, he would argue, is an easier fit. That's all. All right, I'm going to end this. I have some other more political stuff that I need to do because I've been I've been interviewing people here in Kenya because I wanted to do a series where I'm doing interviews from around the world. And I started here. I mean, I started in Qatar, but I've been able to get certain interviews here, and I've been able to put those online. I'm going to do that everywhere I go. At least I'm going to try to. Maybe not Egypt. Egypt is, yeah, I don't want to get arrested. But I'm going to try. Kenya is doing a basic income experiment. Love it. What I would wish is that yeah, that's good. Look at this. I was here today. Let me show you something. Wait a minute. It is all right. Right here. I used to say keeper.
Same rate.
They pay a flat tax. I mean, they pay a flat rate.
Yes, flat rate.
The people. Wait. Just so I'm clear. Wait. I gotta hear that again. The people who live here pay the same amount as for electricity and water as the rich.
In fact, water is even more expensive because most houses don't have tapped water.
Here's the thing. If you're in Nairobi is just a city. Like, it looks like a city like any other city. A city is a city is a city is a city. And businesses and everything else. I mean, you'll find everything else. Like, if you were in the States, if you were in Richmond, Virginia, you would see, just a city. There would be certain parts where you'll see the projects where they cram all the people who essentially can't make ends. That the city does. The people who can't make ends, who have difficult means. All of Africa is not that way. And I know some people think that all of Africa is not that way. But this is a part of it, of Nairobi, that is brutal to be there. Because I can't fathom living there, if that makes sense. And I'm on a trip because my wife and I like to travel, and this trip was planned last year. At least the planning of the trip started last year. If I am being honest, I fell ass backwards into being able to do this. There's stuff I need to do with treatments because I have to, medical stuff I need to attend to, and of course work because ends doing this. You go through that area and what does it mean to be a lefty? Right? Like, what does it mean to be a lefty on this? If I'm talking to, I guess my thinking is I'm on a fucking trip, like to go from point A to point B around the world. And they're living in squalor. What does it mean to be a lefty? The boss at my other company, I'm not gonna say the name of it, but I remember I've talked to him before, and he's a Democrat. He's a run-of-the-mill Democrat. But I think he tries to be a decent guy, despite being somewhat of a plutocrat. It would only go so far. Like, regardless of how nice of a guy you think they are, ultimately they're not willing to give up their differential advantage. They're not going to give up their ends. There's not going to be a situation where there's an evening playing field if they can help it. It doesn't matter how nice they are. it just built into the psychology of the person. They're not going to want to give up something if there's any chance that they're going to need that thing, especially from the standpoint of cash, and especially from the standpoint of the way our society sees money. In the same way that differential advantage is not necessarily going to be given up, I ask myself the same question here. Are you okay with evening this? And then the question becomes, I guess, what does it mean to be even in this? Is it a bringing up of their standards, or is it a lowering of my standards? And if it's a lowering of my standards, of course, like anybody else, the answer is going to be, well, I'm a lefty, but I don't know, dog. I suppose that any situation like this would have to be dealt with by improving other standards than bringing other people down. Why you get into the problem of the plutocrat? Can't bring everybody up to the standards of a billionaire, millionaire. All right, let's see. I'm off the rails. Everyday Progressive Show. Jamal, the UBI raises all standards to save money compared to what we're doing now. Oh, I agree with you. No, they should have a UBI. I agree with you. I don't disagree with the UBIs. I don't disagree with the UBI at all. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a very good idea. Right now, they're in the middle of austerity here. They are hitting the lowest part of the society with tax hikes. The rich are skating. Everybody else is going to have to pay for higher internet calls, higher phone calls, higher oil calls. And, Uber will do something like, it takes, maybe let's say 30% off the top. A percentage of that goes to the president's son, who essentially has this kind of corrupt deal where he's getting a cut. And then you look at what Uber takes, and it's like $1 left over. It's amazing, man. But yeah, austerity, yeah, that's what they're doing now. They had a major fight over it in Congress, or in Parliament over it. I was watching in Parliament. The Parliament is awesome. All right, I'm going to end this right here. I feel like a UBI without federal jobs guarantee is a trap and desperate plan. Yeah. But see, yes, Stephen, I agree with you. It depends on how you do it. It depends on how you do it and what they think it is. Depends on how you do it and what they think it is. If it's too much where they don't have to work, then you're probably going to have some people working. If it's a situation where some people are like artists or, let's say, like Uber drivers, then this would be amazing for them because it gets them over the hump of needing their needs. It depends on what it is. Does the computer come with Minesweeper at least? That's funny. All right, I'm going to end this because my signal is getting a little flaky. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the Patreon. Thanks all.